So welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring the 2021 Minnesota Book Awards finalists in the competitive General Nonfiction category, one of my very favorite categories. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, and the organization hosts them in its capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's book award is sponsored by Education Minnesota. My name is Shawn Otto. I'm a nonfiction writer, fiction writer, and a screenwriter, and a science advocate. I've won the Minnesota Book Award a couple of times. It was a tremendous honor, and it's so much fun to go to the ceremony. I'm really looking forward to getting back to the live ceremony. That's really one of the highlights of the year, I know, for a lot of writers and readers in Minnesota. This format, however, I'm really excited about because I've hosted these Meet the Finalists panels in the past, and we would get maybe about 100 people, 150 people, something like that, which was a pretty decent turnout. But I understand that the last time, the inaugural year that we did this on Zoom, we got maybe 10 to 20 times that. So I'm really happy about the opportunity for these guys' work to be exposed to that many more potential readers, because you're in for a treat. There are fantastic books in this group, and you're going to really enjoy the conversation. So as we get started, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the Dakota people, indigenous keepers of the land in which many of us on this panel recording are zooming in from today. This land was reserved for the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, shortly before the U.S. Acknowledged Minnesota as a state, and it remains sacred to them today. The Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of story in this place we now call Minnesota. The Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, organizers of the Minnesota Book Awards, really work hard to honor this tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we work to lift up storytellers in our state. For this latest installment of the Minnesota Book Awards popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined by Sarah Kiefer, author of 100 Cookies, the baking book for every kitchen with classic cookies, novel treats, brownies, bars, and more, published by Chronicle Books. Yelena Bailey, author of How the Streets Were Made, Housing Segregation and Black Life in America, published by the University of North Carolina Press. Anton Treuer, author of The Language Warriors Manifesto, How to Keep Our Languages Alive No Matter the Odds, published by Minnesota Historical Society Press. And Jonathan Slaght, author of Owls of the Eastern Ice, A Quest to Find and Save the World's Largest Owl, published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, part of Macmillan Publishers. Congratulations to each of you for the finalist nod. I've been in your shoes, and I know how much anticipation you're feeling. In the interest of making the most of our short time together, I'm going to begin with a round robin question that I'd like each of you to answer from your own individual perspective, and then I'll have a question specific to each of you and your finalist book. Okay? So the general round robin question that I'd like you each to think about is, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the writing process itself. I know that a lot of people that are fans of the Book Awards are really interested in how writers approach their work. So I'd like to get each of you to share a little bit with our viewers about how you approach tackling an immense project like writing a nonfiction book. I mean, how do you narrow it down to a subject matter? And how do you kind of wrap your arms around it and approach organizing it? Is it a narrative for you, or do you use outlines, or do you just kind of write? So just kind of tell us that, and then how do you keep it interesting and compelling? A lot of people think of fiction as page turning, but many people don't realize that sometimes nonfiction is even more page turning, and I'm really interested in your skills in that area. So to begin, I think we'd like to start, and we'll just kind of go down this path here with Anton.
Giroux, thanks so much for having me on. I first just wanted to extend my congratulations to Sarah, Yelena, and Jonathan for your finalist nominations. It's exciting to be in your company, and really honored and privileged to be part of the discussion today, as well as all the other great work that the Friends has been involved in. For me, I've published many books, and I think each has its own story for how it gets created. For this one, I did a lot of the writing living Zoom life from a corner of my bedroom. Among other things, I have 9 children. I mean, that action wasn't even really responsible, but writing has been, dealing with that. I've had kids interrupting my classes. One time they came running in here and said, Dad, where are all the hatchets? And I could only think what could go wrong there behind the door in the garage. So, I sometimes laugh when people ask, tell me about your place of quiet tranquility where you do all your creative work, because I feel like it's, even my interruptions get interrupted sometimes. But for me, the Language Warriors Manifesto is probably my most personal work to date. I ended up sharing a lot about my own story, my own quest for relearning my Indigenous language and culture, as well as a collective effort that a lot of other people have been involved with. I did develop an outline of what I wanted to cover, and then I mainly spoke from the heart. And, I think our personal stories are deeply compelling. And it's true that nonfiction is a really exciting category. You've got all kinds of true life stories that are sometimes, even more remarkable than the fictitious ones that people generate. And I think relatable and compelling. There's a lot to say about the work itself, but I think it's something that really strikes a chord with a lot of people. All of us human beings have been touched by colonization. White folk were being really hard on each other for a long time before they took it to the rest of the world. And among the things that happen within the colonial framework is solving problems, often through violence and so forth. And why would we think that all the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems could be saved by the colonial way of solving problems? They can't. And within Indigenous communities and the unique worldviews embedded in our languages are more than vestigial remnants of some different ways of looking at the world and solving problems. So I think that is relatable to everyone, as well as the stories of, triumph through adversity and so forth. So excited to share the work with everybody.
Okay, thank you. That's a great answer. And I'll just kind of not quite repeat the question, but just recenter it here for Sarah and for each of you following. Just how do you wrap your head around, what you're going to do? I mean, in your case, 100 cookies. How do you wrap your head around the whole world of baking and narrow it down and begin to focus on an idea?
Yeah, it felt very daunting going into it. Originally, I had proposed a different cookbook to my publisher because I like to do a variety of different baked goods. And my agent had suggested cookies. I had a cookie recipe go viral in 2017, and she wanted me to build off of that. And she was right, it was a good idea. But at the time I was like, 100 cookies, that's so many cookies. And with I have a cookbook that came out before this, where there's a cake chapter where there's a base cake recipe, like 3 bases, and then you can play with those. So the recipe work isn't as daunting. But this is, pretty specific, 100 different cookie recipes that I need to come up with. So I set out just going through every cookie book I can find. I went to the library, I scoured like used bookstores looking for every cookbook that was cookie based. Like, what do people want in a cookie book? What does everyone have in their cookie book? And then how do I want to make mine different? And so that's how I sort of like plotted out the book. And then just kind of came up with, I wanted classics, really solid recipes that people wanted to bake over and over again. And then I just wanted the rest of the chapters that followed to just be recipes people could play with and make their own. I'm a huge believer that taste is subjective. Like, there's no best recipe. We all have our own unique way of liking food, and that's good. And so I wanted to come up with recipes that people could like or make their own. And so that's kind of how I started the project. The actual work, most of my work is testing recipes. Like, I have a notebook. I'm Gen X, so I still, have a paper and pencil that I write everything down in, because like going to the computer is not in my nature. So I have just notebooks and notebooks of recipes. I make all my notes on those. And then once a recipe is complete, I move to the computer, type it in. I'm kind of a procrastinator, so a lot of that comes at the very end when my manuscript is due, just quick getting all my recipes on the computer and tweaking head notes. But it's just kind of just a day, like every day I get up, I bake, I jot notes, next day, and then spend like a month before my manuscript's due piecing it all together and writing like the intro and head notes and all of that. So that's kind of what it looks like for me.
Wow. So it's a pretty involved process, and
yeah, it
a
is.
lot of research goes into it.
It does. And yeah, I think when I did my taxes for my first book, I spent $600 just on butter for the year, like testing recipes, and chocolate was $400. It was just outrageous sums of money on these things, but you have to test over and over and over again until it's perfect. So
can we sign up to be on your test committee?
You sure can. I do it, like my parents drive from Bloomington, they'll pick up stuff and they pass it out to all their friends. And before COVID, my husband's a teacher, so he would just bring everything into school and all the teachers would take the stuff. So
Wow, that's great. Well, great answer. Thank you.
Thanks.
And Jonathan, I know that same question, just how to wrap your mind around the subject matter, and then how do you focus it? What's your strategy for creating a book that's kind of a page turn? And I know that in your case, you really had a specific target in the owl, but still making a decision about how do you even begin to tackle the subject. Do you write as a narrative? Do you write it as a story that stretches beyond? I mean, how did you approach that?
Well, this is my first book, so I don't have a point of reference, but conveniently, I mean, it's based on my PhD dissertation, which is highly structured. So as far as an outline, that was the outline, and I started writing the initial texts as part of my field journals as I was in the woods in Russia, living in a truck next to a river, kind of jotting down thoughts and notes from the day. And so that research ended in 2010, and around 2016, I translated a book, but then I thought if I could translate it, maybe I could write my own. And that came to mind as my source material. So I went back, I dug up those notes, put them all together into one document, a PDF that was about 40 pages. So right there, that was it. That was the core of the book, and it had a beginning, a middle, and an end, because it kind of traces the path of the research project. And then it was just a matter of what areas to expand, what passages what areas to delete entirely, because I still want to work in Russia and I still want to have people who collaborate with me. And so the first draft wrote itself pretty quickly, and just I had a first draft done in maybe 6 months after that point. And I was working. I'd wake up early, get my family out the door, and then sit down and work on the text until about 9 o'clock. Then I'd switch over to my day job. When I'm in the U.S., I work from home. I usually travel about 3 months out of the year to Russia and elsewhere. So when I'm here, I'm at home. So every morning, a little bit each day. And frankly, you know, I like being outside. I like being in the wilderness. And so being able to revisit that every morning and revisit some of these, you know, some pretty exciting periods of my life was really fun. Now, the trick was then turning that from a field journal into a book. And that's what I had no experience with. But I found an agent who then found a publisher, and my agent and my editor did a really nice job of helping me structure it, making it seem less like a field journal, where, you know, every chapter was, I woke up, I did things, I went to bed, and, you know, gave it more of a narrative arc and more blending to make it seem more like a story than a field journal.
Great, thank you. And Yelena, it's, you know, in reading your book, I would have been so, you know, intimidated by the process of approaching just this massive subject. I mean, you've got 35 pages of footnotes in here, and, you know, juggling all of that in your mind as you try to narrow it down and then coming up with a strategy. How long did that take, and how did you figure out your angle?
Yeah, this is a great question, because I don't feel like people ask, at least that often, me about writing process. But so I approach it in this book kind of like a puzzle, and you can maybe tell that reading it. But for me, it's like there's this idea I've been thinking about for several years, and this question of like, how did we get here? Why do people believe this? You know, how are these things connected? So that's kind of the driving force, because it's a long process. But then when I tell people lately that I started this in the summer of 2017 and they didn't finish final copy edits till 2020, they're like, that's a long time to invest in this, right? And to invest in something where I often felt like those detective shows where you have the wall and you're like, there's a line going here and then a thing over here. And I'm like, and this connects this media campaign and this television show. But like, that's kind of how I'm thinking. And then for me, the process of writing, I'm very linear, that I have to sit down for, you know, like a block of several hours, and I have to have my goals of like, I'm writing this many words a day and I'm meeting this, because that's just the only way to get through, you know, 80,000 words is for me to map it out backwards. But yeah, it was in some ways kind of thinking and moving all over, because it is such an interdisciplinary thing. But at the same kind of time, I wrote this as something that I wanted to be engaging and for the public, and really just an idea that I had been curious and wanted to figure out, that I hope that readers would similarly kind of be like, oh, I had noticed this, but I couldn't really explain it. And this book is walking me through all these things that I had never really considered before. At the same time, you know, it's a weird hybrid book, that it's a public book, but a university press. So I still had to, like, you know, muster the research to to make 2 rounds of peer review and all of that jazz. So yeah, I thought it's a long process, but I think that time was great. It can be daunting, but it's helpful because it did help refine so that it is massive, but at least I hope, you know, makes sense because of the time to think through and elaborate why, you know, a marketing campaign in 1950 is connected to Moonlight in, you know, 2016, right? So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you. I always am curious about that whenever I talk to different writers, just because it seems like some people, you know, take like Jonathan's approach, which, you know, I talked to Kate DiCamillo once about this, asked her, you know, about her process, and she writes 2 pages a day and quits. And there's no way I could write like that. I completely envy people who can, but I have to be kind of obsessive compulsive, or I'm afraid I'm going to lose the threads, which is probably a very unhealthy relationship with writing for me, but that's the way it is. And I think that, I guess, everybody's personality really determines maybe how they approach it. So thank you all. So I'd like to start off then with our individual questions, with one for Anton that ties in. I'm going to read it here because I've got a kind of a long lead into all of these, actually. But I think that they're really helpful. It's kind of, I want to be thoughtful in how we frame these, because I think that the points that are in each of your books are really important to be kind of thought about and contemplated. And Anton, your work has focused in throughout your career in your books in many ways on really bridging the cultural divides between white American and indigenous people, particularly Ojibwe, which is something you had to navigate growing up with parents of either background. Your mom was Ojibwe and your dad was a German immigrant. And I can relate somewhat in that my mom was an immigrant from Germany, and later she lived in South America in a small village in the Amazon basin. And as a kid, I learned that I had access in German and actually in Spanish, but I noticed it more in German, to concepts that I had no way of framing words around in English. One example is Weltanschauung, which is, I'm not going to bother defining it. You can look it up, but you can't really define it. Even the stuff you find online in English doesn't quite capture it. And now there's all kinds of neuroscience that supports that living in other cultures and learning another language improves your creativity and your innovation, your leadership ability, and it staves off dementia because it forms different pathways in your brain that you can utilize. So you have alternative routes to concepts and to execution. So reading the Language Warriors Manifesto, I thought a lot about how language is not just words. It sort of contains and conjures up an entire way of seeing the world and even being in the world, a culture. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and just kind of open the door into that and maybe share some examples of words or concepts or even ways of seeing the world that you found in Ojibwe that we don't have in English, and the value that that might have in expanding somebody's perspective.
Sure, thanks for a great question. Every language embodies a unique worldview, and languages reflect the values and worldview of a people, but they also shape the way that we look at the world. And so, a couple examples that maybe pop to my mind in Ojibwe, our word for an elder, Gichiaya'a, literally means great being. Our word for an elderly woman, Mindamuye, means one who holds things together and describes the role of the family matriarch. And in English, we have a lot of words too, but they don't convey quite the same meaning. We have elderly woman, aged woman, hag, and how many elders do we have on the cover of Cosmo? So I would say that, the English speaking world is pretty ageist. But when you're operating in an Ojibwe language environment, you don't have to say things like respect your elders. It's kind of built right in with any word you could possibly use to talk about them. And that shapes the way that we look at the world and engage with them. So in English, we can say respect your elders, but it doesn't convey quite the same meaning. We also have, so many cultural concepts that are built in with languages. For example, the word for my body, ni yao, is also embedded in the word for my namesake, ni owe'e. So like if I gave somebody a native name, we kind of look at the body as a cup. It's temporary housing for our soul. It's not like we're humans looking for a spiritual experience. We are spirits having a temporary human experience. And if someone gives somebody a name in their cultural tradition, it's kind of like they're taking something out of their cup and putting it into somebody else's. So this is Niyao and this is Niyoe'e. And so all of that's built right in, and you don't have to say, or even try to explain, you need a couple paragraphs to do that, what that kind of relationship means. Or even in Ojibwe, you have words like, Gikawabamin, which means, it's our word for goodbye, but it doesn't mean goodbye. It just means I'll see you again. So this world or the next. It kind of affirms a soul-to-soul connection. And so for me, I think, every language has its own distinct beauties and ways of looking at the world, and they're all really, really important. We're at a time when there are over 7,000 languages spoken in the world. Over 2,000 are going to be going extinct in the next decade or so. We only have 100 languages that are spoken in colleges and universities. And we are seeing, I think people are aware that we have kind of a bottleneck happening with, the species on our planet and challenges with regard to climate change. But we have that happening with regard to human worldviews, cultures, and languages too. And there's really a lot at stake. And I think in a country like America right now, obviously, there are a lot of people interested in fighting a culture war. But what makes America great is not who wins the culture war, but if our country is big enough to accommodate, tolerate, and actually genuinely support a diversity of worldviews, cultures, and people. And it's ultimately, things like language revitalization are not just about the pretty birds singing in the forest and don't we want to hear all the pretty birds, but how can we figure out how to get along? Is democracy big enough to tolerate diversity? And to me, the litmus test is, what do we do with all the diversity we have here now? Are we just going to crush it, run it over, assimilate it all? Or are we going to find a way where all of us can live in harmony in this space? So we have a lot to learn from one another.
That's great. Thank you. One quick follow-up. I've often heard, not often, but a couple of times, like around, when people talked about sweats and different stories, talk about grandfather stone. And when you were talking about elders, I was kind of reminded of that and the role of the word grandfather or grandmother in particular. And I'm not sure that I fully understand it. I think it plays one of those special roles that maybe doesn't translate fully. Could you enlighten me on that?
Well, sure. I think there's probably a couple things going on. One is age confers honor and respect. And I mean, there are many, many trees in this state that are far older than the whole country, and the rock's older yet. Another thing that happens within the Ojibwe language is that, there confers a sense of animacy to lots of things, not just human beings. And so I think, in the English speaking world, we kind of have a hierarchy of like humans, other kinds of sentient life, and then everything else is inanimate. And in the Ojibwe world, although there are linguistic categories, which are probably better thought of as a little more arbitrary for what's animate and inanimate, there is a sense of spiritual potency and life force in all kinds of things. And I think that's something that's acknowledged within the cultural code and kind of embedded in the language too.
Great, thank you. Sarah, so your work really focuses on baking, but it's always been more than baking, it seems to me. You use baking as a way to create a family identity, and you write about how you didn't really ever have family recipes and things like that growing up. So that's an important part of it for you, it seems, and that kind of the traditions and culture that go along with that. And you share a lot of that in your Vanilla Bean blog and in 100 Cookies, which seems to me is destined to become just a gold standard of cookie baking. So beyond the monumental time developing and testing the recipes and actually baking and photographing all these amazing cookies and bars, you offer a lot of tips and tricks that sort of create an approach to baking that goes beyond the recipes. And I found that really interesting because it kind of gives an overall structure in a way, creates a story around the recipes. So this is kind of a 4-part question about that. The first part is, what mindset or practice is most important to bring to an approach to baking? And I'll read through them, and then I'll read through them all, and then I can remind you if you need. Can you give us an example of a favorite tip or trick? And maybe just as important, where do you see people most often run into trouble when they're baking, especially baking things like cookies? And since I like to do that. And lastly, what's your advice for enjoying your book without gaining 100 pounds?
So for the first question, my mindset going into baking, I think that a lot of times people are intimidated by baking more than cooking because it's a formula. All the recipes are a formula. You're supposed to follow them correctly so you get the result. And for some people, that's very off-putting or intimidating, either because they don't like math and science. Growing up, it was that, and that's me too. So it's kind of funny that I love baking, but or they've like made a lot of mistakes in the kitchen and they don't want to keep trying because it's not fun to not do something right. So my approach that I want to communicate to people is that yes, there's this box and structure to baking, but baking also is fun. And once you learn the box, you can play and have fun with your baking. And so I want to communicate. I feel like, especially with just so many blogs and cookbooks coming out and all of this, there's always, and I said this a little bit before, but there's this approach like there are best recipes and you have to do it this way. And I don't think that's true. I think that there is a structure, but that there isn't a best of anything, and that taste is subjective. And I want people to sort of, I keep using the word intimidated, but I want people to not feel intimidated approaching a recipe, that hopefully my voice in the head note and my instructions is one of kindness, because that's how I entered baking, was someone I messed up and someone came alongside me and was so kind and helped me work through the recipe. And I also came, I feel like, to baking backwards, where it wasn't like I didn't go to pastry school. I got thrown into it at a coffee shop I worked at. They needed help. I knew how to make cookies, but not very well. And so I had to memorize like how dough looks. I had to memorize a recipe. It wasn't because I knew how those things work together. It was just like, this is what you have to do. And so that's how I kind of learned how to bake, and then later went back as an adult, or I guess I was an adult at the time, but now in my 30s and 40s, I went back and then researched like why does baking soda work with acidic ingredients and all of that kind of stuff. So I know there's people coming in at all different directions. Some people have baked a lot, some people haven't at all. There's a lot of people writing me telling me their kids are starting with my book. And so I want to encompass all of those, and like, it's a safe space. You might mess up. I still mess up when I bake sometimes if I'm distracted or whatever, but baking can be really fun, and it's a great way to connect with people. You bring banana bread over to your neighbor, you have a little conversation. It's great. It's a way to connect with people. And so I feel like it's more than just making something. It's this connection of, we have nostalgia from memories of the past. Like, every time I make banana bread, I think of my mom making it in the kitchen, and like all those memories go through with it. And so it's so many things, and yet it's still just food. There's all these layers. So I just want people to kind of tap into that with my book. I hope that made sense.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
No, I mean that phrase, breaking bread with people, I mean, it's not breaking, it should probably be breaking
Right.
cookies with people, but breaking bread with people, it's a way to get people to kind of put their defenses aside and to connect. And I think
Right.
that there's reason for that.
It's like for me, I grew up in church culture too. So like the whole like symbolism of communion is there for me, in a different way, but like we are sharing with each other and breaking, whether it's a chocolate chip cookie or, you may have this memory of breaking the wafer at church or whatever. Like, these things go with you through life. So I think that that's true.
Right.
Communion goes beyond church, like, it's more than that. So it doesn't have to have, religious connotations, but just that symbolism of that a lot of people associate with, connecting, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So, quick question.
Yes.
Butter. So, I've
butter.
heard you keep butter cold and then it releases its moisture all at once, and that makes things flakier or crispier. But then you make sure that you don't have it too cold when you're making cookies. What's the opinion on butter?
Right. So it depends on the recipe. A lot of recipes start with room temperature butter, where it's not quite 70 degrees. So it's not going to melt when you touch it, but you can kind of bend it. And most recipes start that. Melted butter you can melt butter and put it in your cookie recipe. Some call for that. It'll make a chewier cookie. So it just depends on what you're looking for. But most of my recipes use room temperature butter. And cold butter is just going to take longer to get to the texture you want. So you want to start with it kind of soft. It just makes things go faster. So you can get to eating the cookies faster.
So if I like chewy cookies, I should microwave my butter first.
Yes, but it might not work that way in every recipe. So you're going to want to look for a recipe that has melted butter. And I do have one in my cookbook, the brown butter ones, if you're looking for.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, so this is kind of the Indiana Jones entry this year. Your work kind of seems to have that theme of, the Indiana Jones approach to science as adventure. And I guess that kind of comes from your whole approach. You grew up living in different cultures around the world and speaking different languages. I know you lived in Germany for 4 or 5 years in your pre-teens, and I don't know where else you lived, but maybe you can share some of that. But now you live in urban America, and yet you fell in love with the roadless wilderness of Eastern Russia, probably as far an extreme opposite as you could be, except for maybe Antarctica, at least in the minds of Americans. So we have America and Russia, and we have urban and wild. And then within Russia, your work is in conservation. So it's also kind of bridging very different perspectives of the natural world, from natural resource extraction or ecosystem services on the one hand and wildlife preservation on the other. And so you're balancing these different widely divergent interests. And then you center on what may be one of the world's most exotic and surprising and unusual birds, the Blakiston's fish owl, which you describe as kind of a small bear with feathers the first time you saw one. And you seek to map that knowledge and build that knowledge out so that we can understand it and appreciate it. So I kind of wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what motivates your philosophy of science as adventure, because I know that, scientists are, by and large, it's very similar to art. Scientists that I know approach their work in a similar way, where it's kind of, there's a lot of trial and error, and there's a lot of feeling around in the dark, because you're really creating something new. You're creating knowledge. So share with us a little bit about what you've learned about America and about yourself and about knowledge creation from going to these different extremes.
Sure. Thanks, Shawn. And first, I do hope that people who read the book don't come out thinking that I'm trying to portray myself as an Indiana Jones type. I think you mentioned I lived in different countries growing up. I lived in Uruguay, Panama, West Germany, Canada, Russia. And so I consider myself extremely culturally sensitive. I mean, the first thing I did going to a new country as a kid was learning the language, seeing what people were wearing, and trying to fit in. So, and also the story in the book is very much a collaboration, and the project only worked because of a close collaboration with my Russian counterparts. And the only reason the collaboration worked was because of deep, I would say, cultural understanding. And I feel like not anyone can just wander into the Russian woods and be able to put up with it for a number of weeks at a time and know what to expect. So I do think my strength might be tolerance of unpleasant physical conditions, and I think that's a really important attribute for anyone in my field, in field biology. And there are, of course, there are varying degrees of that. There are people who are field biologists that work in Minnesota and go out, do their go into the woods for the day, then come home. And the other extreme is people who spend seasons out in the forest. So I think that was a key part of the success of the story is just that tolerance for unpleasantness. Now, with respect to why I focused on this owl in Russia out of all things. So I sort of I stumbled into my field. I started learning Russian in the early 1990s when my dad was stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. I happened to go to a high school in the U.S. that offered Russian, so I started taking Russian. And it was only when I made my way to the Far East, the Russian Far East, is on the Sea of Japan, a few years later, that I was like, well, wait a minute, like this is also Russia. There's this like deep, untouched wilderness out here, which was completely different from my frame of reference, Moscow and St. Petersburg, like these giant gray cities. And then I was in the Peace Corps in that region of Russia for 3 years also. And that was really when I understood, I have this interest in nature and in birds, and I speak Russian, I understand Russian culture. I can actually combine these two things and make a real difference here. So some of my colleagues at the University of Minnesota in grad school, they're studying things like how egg shapes are different depending on where a bird is nesting, or plumage variations in American goldfinches. Over there, it's with this owl, where does it go and what does it do when it goes there? So extremely fundamental questions that are extremely important for its survival and trying to be able to continue to be involved in extractive industries, logging and fishing, like still have the local economy churn, but in a way that's sustainable, that isn't completely destroying the forests for the tigers, for the owls. And so really it was seeing that I could make a difference, like a legitimate difference, by working with this bird in this part of Russia. Yeah, I sort of just fell into it.
Well, what drove you to tell it in the way that you did, though? Because it's a pretty compelling story. I mean, it's and maybe it's just the moment that you encountered it that drives it, and it just came out that way. But I thought it was I was interested to hear what you had to say about that.
So yeah, a number of the anecdotes from the story are, again, almost directly from my field notes. And it was, again, you're living in this truck, this metal box with a wood stove at, it was minus 30 outside with, two to four Russian men for weeks at a time. And a lot of things would happen that were just absolutely normal for these guys. And I wanted to be able to sort of document some of these things where, a truck would go through the river. We'd spend, a day getting the truck out of the river. And then everyone just, saw that as a normal thing. No reason to comment on it any further. It was like, well, that's weird. I'm going to write about it. And also, so a lot of my job now is writing grants and getting funders invested in conservation on the other side of the world. And a way to do that is to tell stories that are more personal and just really try to dazzle grant reviewers, right? So they feel like they'd be crazy to not fund this work. And so kind of the storytelling and also I love the place. So being able to speak truthfully and being able to promote this place that I love and these animals that I love, it's easy to do.
Well, you certainly do. Thank you. Yelena, so in reading your book, I was struck by how, and I kind of hinted at this, what a wide variety of threads that you pull together. just kind of tracing where America's racial fabric kind of came from and the unexpected places it pops up that you wouldn't think of. And I've been reading a lot, and it's interesting because a lot of all of your books touch on this in so many different ways. I've been reading a lot of perceptual neuroscience lately. And one of the things that I was reminded of when reading How the Streets Were Made is that in terms of actual neural connections, only about 10% of what we see comes from our eyes. And the other 90% is supplied by other parts of the brain. Okay, so it's like framing. And it's the assumptions that we bring to vision. Our brains construct that. And our eyes really are only gauging what's changing in the visual field. So understanding that and experiments showing that, and the kind of the implicit biases that we all carry, this is kind of how they started through the process of evolution, and the brain is evolving, and it's evolving for two things: survival and reproduction. And the genes that don't, the brains that don't help an organism do that get filtered out. So some of these things are hardwired, like assuming light will be coming from above. If your brain didn't assume that, you'd probably be eaten pretty quickly. And some are adopted from cultural learning and express as implicit biases. So if people can change the unconscious assumptions they use, they can change everything about how they experience reality and physically see the world differently. So in reading your book, one of the things that I was really impressed by was how it kind of works to help the reader do this and kind of fundamentally change just how they experience life as they go through their day. And you really work to really kind of unwind some of these flawed assumptions about Black life in America. And when you do that, I think that the readers get kind of an aha moment. So I wonder if you could share some of the more striking ways that you found, and maybe some are in the book, maybe aren't, some aren't, that people's assumptions can really create faulty perceptions. And maybe what are some habits that non-IPOC people could adopt to see reality a little bit more clearly in their daily lives and kind of prepare the way for some of the redress that you hope the book will help move forward?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate this question because it really captures kind of the larger heart of the book and what it's about, but from a different angle, right? From that neuroscience angle. And I mentioned this with your first question, but a lot of this book for me was answering a question that I kind of knew inherently in some of those ways you talk about in neuroscience, like we, inherently kind of know things, or, experientially I knew certain things about how I was perceived or how people like me were perceived or how we were seen to belong in a different space. But it wasn't until I kind of got further along and finished grad school and began teaching full time that I had the tools to like dig in and analyze that, right? And that's really what this book is for me. Maybe much to the dismay of, some of my advisors and colleagues. I was like, I'm not going to do anything with my dissertation. I want to answer this question that I think people need to know about, right? So that's where this came from. But I think for me, it's like the different language, but the same approach, right? So coming as a kind of scholar from cultural studies, our whole approach is what is the role of culture itself, right? So this book for me is like, what is the role of culture? And by that, I mean the role of our ideologies and systems of beliefs and how those are expressed in media and, campaigns and political discourse and television and film. And what does that do to hold up not only our perceptions of one another in reality, but, the structures that shape our lives, from education to, housing policy. So big project, but really it's that central question that you're pointing to, right? Like, how have we, and we use the language of, socialization, but same theme, right? Like, how have we been socialized to see the world in one another? And then how do we begin to undo that, right? So in the book, I talk really specifically about, kind of like very historically specific kind of faulty perceptions around kind of urban Blackness. So, and the ones that people are familiar with or have talked about. So, kind of the stereotype of the welfare queen and digging into where that comes from and why it continues to shape, our contemporary discourse even right now on how strong our social safety net should be and who threatens that. And, these have very material stakes, right? Or even I think, I have to acknowledge, we're in the Twin Cities and people often ask me with this book, how does this tie to the events last summer and, the trial right now? And I think that's another example, right? Those faulty perception of why when we see certain people, like, young Black men, why have we been socialized to see danger, threat, violence, right? And for me, and I used to say this when I was teaching all the time, that's not something we, that's not a matter of personal guilt, right? Like there's all these systems and, like different kind of fabric of our society is constantly bombarding us and socializing us to see the world in these ways, right? And if we don't realize it, we're just products of that socialization. Like that's not something to personally feel guilty about, but our responsibility is then to start to question that and work against it, right? And so a large part of the book is, yes, those very specific things of like, where did the notion of super predators come from? Or, how do we, I pose this question to readers, like why, when I say the hood or the streets, we're socialized to think Black, violence, drugs, where does that come from, right? The policies, but also through media and other things. But that's really the real thing for me is not just the specific history of those things, but as a culture, how and why are we socialized to see these things and what do we do to kind of, deconstruct those? I think part of your question got on, like what are some kind of healthy habits or ways? And I love that question because one thing I think I'm guilty, and I think probably me and similar generations above me are guilty of, that maybe Gen Z has always called me out on, especially when I used to teach. They're like, you just hit us with all this overwhelmingly depressing stuff, but what are we going to do? What can we actually do about it, right? And I'm like, I appreciate these questions because it's important, right? The purpose isn't just to say, well, we've been socialized, so this is our society, it is what it is, right? But for me, the answer really is in that, constant questioning. So I always say that, in kind of an oversimplified way, we should all go back to being like toddlers, right? So if you spend any time around toddlers, that phase where they're like, well, why? Well, why is that like that? And you answer, and they're like, but why? And they keep asking. As an adults, we're just like, please take my answer and leave it at that. But we lose that, right? And so for me, a good example right now is there's kind of debate publicly on the pay disparity between men's and women's sports, right? And kind of the first easy answer people get is, well, more people watch men's sports, so that's why they're paid more, right? Which on the surface, that makes complete sense, right? More viewers, more pay. But we never ask the question, well, why are we socialized to see men's sports as more entertaining? Why does it garner more viewers? Why are we more attracted to that than women's sports, right? And so it's like digging deeper and asking those questions that gets to kind of, the socialization and the many ways that we are made to see the world that are related to these very kind of, material things like pay, right? So yeah, I'm glad you framed that question because I think, while on one hand, this is definitely a book about, urban Blackness and housing segregation and how that's played out in all these different arenas from, hip hop to film and, all these things. It is largely about this other question of, how are we socialized to see the world and what can we do to begin to undo that?
I was really struck by what you just said there about going back to toddlers. That's actually what they, that's kind of a way that neuroscience again is talking about breaking down your assumptions, is asking that question, why? That some of the greatest innovators in the world are people who ask why about our most fundamental assumptions. So one of the things that I kind of wonder about, I've done a lot of writing about climate change, and people in the climate world are kind of thinking back to smoking and the denial campaign about smoking and how similar that was, but also then how to get people to change. And it turns out that, the people knew for probably 15 years that they were dying of lung cancer from smoking too much. And it really wasn't until we started putting warnings on everything and making it harder for younger people to buy and putting things behind the counter, so you had to ask for it, things that helped increase awareness, that people began to kind of modulate their thinking and get a little bit more conscious control over their behavior, and smoking then started to drop off. And I wonder if you've given any thought to like whether there are some systemic solutions that will help people in a similar way.
That's a great question. It's a hard question. I think your example is a prime one though, of like that. I mean, of course, that's like a policy, right? Of like, we're going to put these behind corners and things like that. And I work in public policy now, so I'm constantly thinking, how does something in like law or legislation then do this ideological work? But what you just pointed out is it also created this idea like, this is something hazardous. This is something that you need to be kept from until you are, you know, acknowledging and understanding the risk in accessing it, right? So, you know, if I think of questions like, you know, our really essential focus on the book is like, you know, the racial wealth gap. And I mean, the fact that if you map over the redlining maps from the 1940s to the Twin Cities today, it's virtually the same, only we've diversified some of the neighborhoods of color, so we have more Latinx groups. So I mean, the obvious answers are kind of those structural things of you know, integration and economic. But I think what I dig into the conclusion a bit is, we're not gonna, in my mind, it's almost the opposite. Like, people, we're not gonna get to a place where we can do that structural work until we're ideologically ready, which means more people have to understand kind of the history and the layers of how we got here, and how these things still have these extreme impacts today. Because it's hard to get people to want to embrace policies that are sacrificial for some, right? But that are ultimately for the better good of our entire society, right? So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
I just dropped one thought in response to, which is that, you know, when you look at something like smoking, it's pretty much just the smoking companies that say, how dare you say such things? Of course, people should still smoke. And they can get their butt sued off. When it comes to like dealing with racial equity, it's really, really different. So we do have systemic supports. They're like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. But there's also huge resistance to that. Today, there are 253 Republican-sponsored voter suppression initiatives that are put forward in 43 different states to undermine the Voting Rights Act. So, you know, when you're looking at how do you engineer systemic change, there's a kind of resistance there that, you know, is fueled by all of this culture war and the erosion of, you know, white privilege and unearned power culturally and politically and economically. And so some people fight to preserve the unearned powers instead of fighting for equity. And so it's a different landscape. But, you know, I do think Yelena's right that we need to be psychologically prepared. Like in Minnesota, our Minnesota NICE training says that we can talk about the weather all day long. But if you want to talk about race, it's so uncomfortable that we're going to be not just, you know, we're going to be communication averse about the topic. And so until we have the psychological preparation to like have a real conversation, how are we going to do real things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. In fact, it seems like that in Minnesota, racism in some ways is probably more pernicious because it's less out front. It's more hidden by that Minnesota NICE, and therefore we feel like we don't have to address it because we don't have the kind of problems that they do down south, say. And so we wind up with higher gaps in equity across the board.
I'll just briefly add that that's a prime example, and I know we're running out of time, but one of the facts I throw in the conclusion is like, we're like what, constantly voted most livable cities, and I think St. Paul has that as their tagline, but we're also consistently voted the second worst metro area for Black Americans, right? And so, I mean, but we're in the North, right? And we're like, we don't have those problems here. But I think that's part of, again, my point and again, I'm coming from this is all matter of fact, you know, and maybe part of it is like before I got to cultural studies for my PhD, I did physics for my undergrad. So I'm like, this is another way of analyzing something, right? To me, I think that the problem this conversations that Anton is getting to is we feel it's entrenched with like a guilt and we don't want to talk about it and it's uncomfortable. And I get that, but we're responding to systems and ideologies and we've been socialized to see it that way. So it shouldn't be as comfortable if we're willing to approach it as such. The stakes though are high, and yeah, and that's the real kind of issue is it comes down to, you know, what does that mean on a material level? So that's the tricky bit.
Yeah. Well, what I think you both do is make it, you help break down those barriers about it being something uncomfortable, and you make it really interesting, and you do a really good job of inviting the reader in. So I just wanted to give thanks to our tremendous finalists in general and all of you watching as viewers for taking part in this Meet the Finalist panel. If you enjoyed this talk, you can find a treasure trove of past events on the YouTube channel of the Minnesota Book Awards steward organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. Thank you again very much for attending, and I hope you enjoyed this talk and have a wonderful rest of your day.